people talking about machine learning will try to convert them more into networks.
By all means.
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
so
so,
over to you.
yeah, so shall I start? Okay, yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Like Dr. Sarah Bannon was saying, my name is Arshad Jamka. I'm based at Warwick University. I was a colleague with Dr. Anand for quite some time before he left to go back to India. My interest basically is in reliability in distributed systems, and now we've been talking about sensor networks and some of the new buzzwords about edge networks and cloud computing. These are kind of more recent interest. So today I will be talking a little bit about a problem which we call computational offloading in edge networks, and then we're looking at the notion of trust. What can we do when we have to offload a job in an edge network where potentially those networks may be subject to network attacks? Right, so some of the motivation that we had is basically you have an IoT device which is running some application. For example, it could be a route finder, it may be monitoring some pollution level, it may be like Dr. Anand was showing a little bit earlier, picking up sounds in the wild. What happens is very often, depending on the type of application, the hardware, the IoT device may not have sufficient resources to run the full application. So some applications may be compute intensive. And if you want to run it, it may run, but however, it drains the battery that is used to power those IoT devices. Or what can happen is it doesn't run properly because the hardware isn't powerful enough. So what has been suggested as a possible solution is to try to use more powerful computing nodes that run those applications on behalf of the IoT device. So the process of running the application on behalf of the IoT device is what we call computational offloading. Those IoT devices offload the computation onto a more powerful compute node. And depending on where the compute node resides, we'll end up getting either cloud computing if the compute node is kind of far away from the vicinity of where those IoT devices are, or we call them an edge node if the compute node resides on the edge of the network. The problem is if there is one IoT device and then there are multiple compute nodes, or what I will say from now on, multiple compute edge nodes, there's this problem where that IoT device will have to start choosing among a competing set of compute nodes. So which one does it choose? Well, the choice can be, or the selection can be based on several factors. For example, it can be based on the available resources at the edge nodes, or it can be based on the expected quality of service being provided by those edge nodes. However, system perturbations can exist, right? So for example, it can be that one edge node has a lot of available resources, but that edge node is currently under attack. Or for another matter, or for another example, you can have an edge node with a lot of available resources. And because of that, a lot of the IoT devices have decided to offload their job onto that edge node. And you end up having that edge node going through some kind of unexpected high load. And it is not possible for it to satisfy its quality of service anymore. So how do we go about choosing a good edge node that will guarantee a certain that the job will be executed? So a quick outline of the talk today. I will talk a little bit about IoT devices and edge networks, introduce them a little bit, and then formally introduce the problem of computational offloading. We'll talk about the system and fault models. What are the kind of problem that we expect the system or the network to be subjected to? Then we'll try to define trust detectors and the notion of trust trackers. And then we will visit the problem of computational offloading and what can be achieved if we have trust detectors or trust trackers in the network. We show some theoretical results, and then we will evaluate some of the algorithms that we present, and then we'll briefly conclude with future work. So basically, an IoT device, we assume it has a unique ID, it has a limited amount of resources, so it will have a very weak CPU, very little memory, but also it will have a communication interface. And an IoT network is taken to be a set of IoT devices. Because each IoT device has a communication interface, they can potentially kind of communicate with each other. And a potential application for this can be, for example, environment monitoring. Then on the other hand, we have what we call an edge node, which again will have a unique set of ID. It doesn't have to pick IDs from the same set as those IoT devices. On the other hand, it is resource rich. It has a powerful CPU, it has lots of memory, right? And again, it has a communication interface that will allow it to communicate either with other edge nodes or with an IoT device. And we call an edge network, or an edge network will be a set of edge nodes. An edge network brings a compute platform and data storage close to the point of request. And as such, it brings low latency and also it helps save bandwidth. So the difference between an edge network versus cloud computing is mainly an issue of latency. And so for a lot of safety critical systems, an edge network is being proposed as a way to dealing with the real-time aspect of such jobs, as opposed to looking at cloud computing. So here, on the left-hand side here, we can see a resource-constrained IoT device. As you will notice, it has a 16 megahertz CPU, 32 kilobyte RAM. Not very much when you consider that potentially the code part of a program will take potentially around 20 to 25 kilobyte of RAM, leaving just maybe 4 or 5K of memory space for data. It tends to be battery powered, so usually 2 AA batteries, right, which has finite lifetime. And also it has no stable storage. So what happens is if those devices end up crashing because, let's say, it ran out of energy, all the information that has been gathered during that time will be lost. On the other hand, we have a resource-rich edge node here, right? It's got a CPU with capabilities running to the gigahertz, right? It's got kind of a lot of memory, usually powered, mains powered, and has a large amount of storage. So what's expected is when the IoT device has a task or a job which is compute intensive, right? It will offload, it will send the job to the resource-rich node that will be able to execute the task. And then once the execution has completed, it will pass the result back to the IoT device. So IoT applications are becoming increasingly sophisticated. So we're starting to use IoT applications for example, health monitoring, crowd monitoring, in terms of security for using face recognition. So IoT applications are becoming increasingly sophisticated, and they require a lot of compute power, which is beyond the capabilities of those IoT devices. Then, of course, the availability of edge nodes allow us to be able to supplement those IoT devices. So the idea, as I had said earlier, is we try to offload the computation from an IoT device onto an edge node, right, which will then pass back the output to the IoT device. Looks very simple in effect, so nice idea. But how about when the edge node is susceptible to perturbations? So for example, you've got network attacks and overload. What can happen is you have a delayed response, It can be possible that you have even the wrong response, right? So what we want to do is we want to offload to a good node rather than offloading to a compromised node. Here we use the word a compromised node to mean a node that is either is under attack, or it could be that the that node is overloaded. So here, what we see is we've got an IoT device, right? And it has potentially 4 different options. You have an edge node, which we've said here is a well-behaved edge node, right? So this node has been performing pretty well. Then you have an edge node that has been behaving possibly well, right? Most of the time it's been all right, but from time to time, the quality of the service or there has been some, let's say, misbehaviors from that node. And then you have a node which is overwhelmed. So for example, it could have been, it was a well-behaved node, it was a well-behaved edge node. And then because all of a sudden, a lot of IoT devices have decided to offload their jobs onto that edge node, now it is overwhelmed and it can no longer satisfy its quality of service. And then you have potentially an edge node here, which is potentially under attack, so a badly behaved edge node. So the idea is, how are we going to ensure, how are we going to make use of, how does this IoT node is going to sample or at least decide which of those edge nodes to offload a job to. So if that IoT device make a wrong decision and offloads onto a badly behaved edge node, it may end up not getting an answer back, or it may even get the wrong answer, right? On the other hand, if it sends to an overwhelmed edge, well, what can potentially happen is it does get an answer back, but after a long delay. So being able to correctly select an edge node is very important. So I've said the problem is similar to a client looking for a tradesperson, for example, a plumber. Some of them are reliable, others may not be reliable, or some of them were reliable and then they become unreliable because they have too much work to do. So which one to choose? It is impossible to predict the future, right? So what we can do is then we try to learn from previous interactions. So learning here is not intended in terms of machine learning, but we try to see how it is that we can obtain information from the past to try to infer the future. The decision whether an IoT device will offload to an edge node is based on its previous interactions with that node. So very often, very similarly, where a client is used to, let's say, a given plumber, most of the time, the client may end up going back to the same plumber if their previous interactions were good, right? So in some kind of loyalty. However, several challenges exist. Some of them might be, some of the edge node may be unstable. So they alternately behave well and then they behave badly, right? Or it could be the fact that the resource constraint to store the interaction history is not big enough. So for example, the amount of memory, like I said, the amount of memory to say to record data may be just around 4 kilobyte big, right? Storing information about those interactions will quickly overwhelm the memory, such that when people end up using trust models or whatever models they will learn, they can only do that on a finite amount of information rather than having a long interaction history available. Also, you end up having energy constraint to request indirect information. So if, for example, as we tend to do as human, if we want to end up looking for a plumber, we end up very often request information from a third party, whether from some friends, to see whether the plumber is reliable. And whenever we try to request those kind of indirect information, messages have to be sent. And whenever messages are sent, a little bit of energy has to be used, right, to send and receive the messages. So for this, the amount of energy or the battery power is used and reduces the lifetime of the network. So very often what we see is, though it is easy to try to say, well, we'll end up offloading a job onto a given edge node, and trying to monitor what are the edge nodes that are good. Doing that involves a lot of different aspects, a lot of different challenges that are counterintuitive to making the system run perfectly well. So the model that we end up assuming here is we have a set of edge nodes, which we denote by R1 to Rn, right? So R stands for resource-rich nodes, right? And they all provide a certain service. So it could be that a resource-rich node provides a service for route finding, another one provides a service for, let's say, pollution monitoring, and so on. And the set of services, the set of those edge nodes is denoted by the word edge, right? And then we have IoT devices, which we denote by C1 to Cm, right? And C stands for resource constraint, right? They subscribe to those services, right? So for example, an IoT device may say it's subscribing to pollution monitoring. And the set of IoT devices, we're going to denote it by IoT. And we say that an edge exists or a link exists between an IoT device, CI, and a resource-rich edge node, or J, if the communication is bidirectional between the IoT device and the edge node. And of course, when we have this kind of communication graph, right, those graph can be represented as a bipartite graph with the edge nodes on one side and the IoT devices on the other side. And more importantly, we assume that the system initially is asynchronous. A system is asynchronous means there is no bound on the latency and on the processor speed. What it means is you can have one network link that is really, really slow. And also you can have a different network link, which is really, really fast, right? And in the same line, you can have one processor which is executing very, very quickly, and you can have another one which is executing very, very slowly, right? However, we assume that the network is reliable, right? So if a message has been put on the line, has been put on a link, the message will ultimately be received at the other end. Then we talk a little bit about what we call a fault model, right? So what we're talking about here is how will an edge node potentially fail. So a fault model here, we have an edge node will fail arbitrarily in providing a service, right? So it will fail arbitrarily, meaning that either the service that it will provide will be delayed, or it may not provide the service at all. It decides to not bother about the service being requested, right? Or another example can be that it does provide the service, but it always returns a wrong value or a wrong answer, right? And then what we have is we define the notion of a failure pattern, which we define as a function that takes time as input, and it returns the set of edge nodes the set of edge nodes that is believed to be bad at a given time t. So, for example, here for a given edge node which we denote by n, the failure pattern f at a given time t, here it says, well, for that edge n, it is good. And then, of course, when the edge n fails, it turns bad. And then if it recovers, it goes from bad to good, and so on and so forth. So some of the terminologies that we're going to use, an edge node can be in the following state. It can be always good, right? That edge node is always in a good state. It always does whatever it said it will do. Or it can be eventually good. So there exists a time t after which that edge node will be good. So for example, maybe if when the system is starting, it cannot fulfill its duty properly. But once booting is over, then it will execute properly. So eventually good means there is a time t after which the edge node will be good. And we say that the edge node is trusted if it was always good or it is eventually good, right? So if at some point in time it will behave well for a sufficiently long amount of time, we say that this edge node is trusted. On the other hand, we have kind of a similar notion when things are going wrongly. So we have the notion of eventually bad. There exists a time t after which the resource-rich node is always bad, right? So just it's similar to eventually good, but here after a time t, the edge node will be bad. So will be bad meaning either it won't respond properly or it may not respond at all. Or we can have an edge node that will be unstable. It will alternate between a good and a bad state. And we say a resource-rich node or an edge node is untrusted if it is not trusted. So as in very often in distributed systems, what we try to do is we have the application at one level, and then we have a middleware that takes care of, for example, dealing with the operating system, dealing with the network, so that the application doesn't become bloated. So again, we are going to adopt a similar approach. And what we want to be able to do is to try to have application running at the higher layer, and then try to come up with a middleware to try to understand what other nodes that we can potentially be used or be selected to run the job an IoT device has, right? So we want to borrow idea from the failure detector formalization of Chandra and Tueg, right? And each device has a software, so each IoT device will have a software module that tracks, that keeps track of the untrusted nodes, right? Or depending on how we implement it, it may track the trusted nodes or the untrusted nodes, right? So what we define a trust detector history, H, it will take an IoT device at a given time t, right? And it will return a set of edge nodes. So basically, H of CT will return the set of edge processors or edge nodes that C suspects to be bad at time t, right? So HCT means it returns the set of edge nodes that IoT device C believes to be bad at a given time t, right? Then we define the notion of a trust detector, which is the software module. It will take a given failure pattern and it will return a set of potentially trust detector history. So it maps a failure pattern to a set of trust detector histories. So what does that mean? Well, that means that as failures occur in the system, the trust detector will return to the application what are the set of nodes that it trusts, or what are the set of nodes that it doesn't trust, right? So that's what it means. As failure occurs, the trust detector will say at various times, well, at this, let's say at a given time t, this is the set of nodes, the set of edge nodes that I trust. At another time t1, it will say, well, this is a different set of nodes that I trust now, right? So what are the set of nodes that the trust detector can return? Well, the trust detector can, for example, the trust detector can return all edge nodes at all times. So maybe if we badly design a trust detector, right, it can return all the edge nodes all the time. It says, well, I'm suspecting all of them to be bad, right? And that's not a very good trust detector, because what you want is you want those trust detectors to say that if a node is good, it will say, well, I can trust it. If a node is bad, it will say, well, I don't trust that bad node. So that already suggests that we have a certain notion of what we call completeness and accuracy, that the ability of the trust detector to do, let's say, wrong suspicion and also of correct suspicion, right? So these two dimensions will characterize the strength of a trust detector. So here, what we want is to have a trust detector that if an edge node is good, it doesn't say that the edge node is behaving badly, right? So what we want is basically, we want to have no resource rich or no edge node is suspected by any IoT device before it fails, before it starts behaving badly, right? So, and we call that strong accuracy, that IoT node isn't going to wrongly suspect an edge node to be behaving badly, right? So here we says for any kind of failure pattern, and for any history or for any trust detector history from a given trust detector at any time, right? And for every edge node, right? What we want is we don't want to have that edge node to be wrongly suspected. So trust detector avoids wrong suspicion. On the other hand, what we want is we want to have what we call strong completeness. Every time a resource-rich edge node fails, it is eventually suspected, right? So again, what we're saying here is when an edge node is untrusted, so it's failing, at some point in time, it is suspected to have failed, right? So here, we want to be able to correctly detect failed edge nodes, but we also want to be able to avoid wrong suspicion. If you have a lot of wrong suspicion, what it means is we're reducing the availability of the network because a lot of the good nodes will appear as failed, as wrong. So what we want to be able to do now is look at the offloading process. So if we have a given IoT device, which will be generated by C, and it has a job to offload, right? The offloading problem of J by C, right? The offloading problem of the task J by the IoT device is defined as follows. We can select a resource-rich edge node, right? Such that C will offload the task to R only if C trusts R, all right? And eventually, on the other hand, the other property that we want is eventually C will trust R permanently, right? So here, the notion of permanently doesn't mean that C will trust R forever after, but what it means is it will be able to trust R for a sufficiently long amount of time for R to correctly execute the job, right? So then what we want is, once you have the offloading problem, we want to be able to have some kind of an offloading engine, right? Which is responsible for offloading the job. So the properties of that offloading engine is as follows. We want the offloading engine to return a set TR, right, of what we call trusted nodes, right? That offloading engine needs to be able to offer to the application where a set of trusted nodes. So for any type of failure pattern we have, right, we'll always end up having the set TR, which is the set of trusted node for this failure pattern. And also, what we want is that offloading engine to always return some set tier of trusted edge nodes, so that the application can offload the job to that edge node, to a given edge node. So once TR is available, then the offloading engine will choose an edge node from that list, right? And we say that an IoT device offloads a job J to a node R, right, to an edge node, when the edge node receives a special control message offload of the job from the IoT device. So now, what you have to imagine now is you have an application running at the top, right? And then you have your network stack at the bottom, right? And what we're trying to see is if we put a trust detector in between the network stack, right, and the application, right? So what is it that we're able to achieve? So we enhance every IoT device. So the IoT device will end up putting a trust detector or a perfect trust detector. And a perfect trust detector, as we said, will have the property of strong accuracy and strong completeness. They never make any mistake in suspicion, and they always detect the correct, the nodes that have failed. So given a network which is asynchronous, meaning we can't put a bound on the latency and the execution speed of processors, right? And you have a set of edge nodes and IoT devices, and we have a given job J that IoT node C wants to offload. Well, the thing is, we can't solve the offloading problem of the task J by the IoT device. So now the problem is, you say, how is it impossible to solve? The offloading problem says we only want to be able to offload, right, if C trusts R, right? So here, the proof of this impossibility is basically in some sense, as soon as an edge node, as soon as an IoT device, let's say, trust a given edge node R, right? And as soon as it offloads a job to R can turn bad, right? So as an edge node R can turn bad at any time, and node C needs to offload its job J onto R as quickly as possible while the edge node is still trusted. Because it has to do that as quickly as possible before the edge node turn bad, it means the network needs to be able to provide some guarantee in terms of the network latency, right? But we assume that network latency is unknown, right? So it can't be bounded. So it means that there is some kind of contradiction between the assumption that we make and the kind of guarantee that the network can produce, right? Hence, we end up having what we call an impossibility. We can't solve that problem, and the problem becomes, this impossibility is because nodes are unstable. Right. So, though we have a trust detector, right, that is perfect, meaning it is very powerful because it has the ability to detect every node that crashes, right, or that's failing. And also it has the ability to avoid wrong suspicion. It is still not strong enough or not powerful enough to enable the problem of computational offloading. So what it means is we need a device which is strictly stronger than the perfect trust detector. And why is that? Well, not only do we need the device to have the ability to discriminate between good nodes and bad nodes, but we also need the device to be able to discriminate between nodes that are stable and those that are unstable, right? So we need to be able to discriminate between nodes that alternately flip between being good and being bad, right? So we borrow an idea from the concept of what we call crash recovery, right, of Aguilera et al. And we use the concept of an epoch counter. So what happens is the same trust detector that we see here, we keep track of a different variable, which we call an epoch, right? So we denote that stronger device as a trust tracker, and we denote it as sigma. It returns the same information as the trust detector. So what are the nodes that are trusted and what are the nodes that are untrusted? But also it returns an epoch vector, right, which contains the number of times each edge node is believed to have failed and recovered, right? So it tells us how many times each and every node in the network has failed before and then it has recovered. And interestingly enough, unstable edge nodes, so nodes that alternately flip between being good and bad, will have ever increasing epoch number because it keeps recovering. The epoch number keeps increasing, while those of stable edge nodes will have bounded epoch values. Initially, the epoch value may start increasing, but because they're stable, they will either be that epoch value will stop changing, right? So epoch values now allows us or gives us the chance to be able to discriminate between stable and unstable nodes. So similar to perfect trust detector, what are the properties we want from a trust tracker? Well, for all edge nodes that are bad, right, and for every IoT device, what we want is either the IoT device permanently suspects R, right, or R's epoch number at C is unbounded. So either C says it permanently suspects R, meaning it knows that R has failed or is bad, or it also knows that R is unstable. That's why R's epoch is at C is unbounded. So the completeness property deals with both nodes that are bad, or that has failed, or nodes that are unstable. But we also want to have, similar to perfect trust detectors, we want to have accuracy. For some good edge process or for some good edge node R, right, and for every IoT device, right, eventually C permanently trusts R, right, So eventually, C permanently trusts R, meaning C knows that good is that R is good, and R's epoch number at C stops changing. So it knows that that R is stable. So accuracy property says that either that the good nodes are permanently trusted. So C permanently trusts R, and R is not an unstable node.
Arshad, there's a question typed in here by Rahul. So Epoch Vector returns unstable nodes is the question. I think there's a confusion around what the Epoch Vector is.
No, so Epoch just returns the number of times at least an edge node is suspected to have failed and then being good again. So what it allows you is to be able to potentially detect nodes that are unstable.
Okay, so it's a single number. It's basically just pinging that edge node and making sure it's live and responding. Is that what it is?
Yeah. So for example, if a node has gone down and then now I can see that it is up again, I increase the epoch number by 1. Okay. So if it keeps going down and then up, right, I keep increasing the epoch number. And at some point in time, if the epoch number is very, very high, let's say 100, then I know that potentially this node is this edge node is unstable.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry to disturb you. I hope you're okay with questions being asked in the middle.
Yeah. That's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay. Please. Carry on. Thank you. I'll keep an eye on the question.
Yes. Thank you. So now we end up having so now what we want is, we've seen that there was an impossibility of solving the offloading problem with a perfect trust detector. Is it possible now to solve the offloading problem with a trust tracker? Well, what we see is, because it was impossible to do that in a system which is asynchronous, now we'll look at the problem in a system which is strictly stronger, where the system is synchronous. Now we know that there are bounds on the latency and the execution speed of processors, right? And we have a set of edge nodes and IoT devices. It is possible to solve the offloading problem if and only if every device is equipped with a trust tracker. So basically, having a trust tracker and developing the offloading engine are equivalent, right? So in some sense, the network stack becomes something as follows. You have a trust tracker at the bottom. You've got your application at the top. We want to be able to develop the offloading engine, right? So it is, to be able to design the offloading engine, we need a trust tracker. And in some sense, having an offloading engine means also that we can implement a trust tracker from that. So what we do is to prove the necessity and sufficiency. So for necessity, we have an algorithm that emulates sigma using the output of the offloading engine. So basically, to be able to prove that the trust tracker is necessary, we can take the output of the offloading engine and reconstruct a trust tracker. On the other hand, to be able to prove the sufficiency of the trust tracker, we take the output of the trust tracker and make it and turn it into the output of the offloading engine, right? So BL here stands for blacklist and EP stands for epoch, right? And gtrust R means a global trust. What are the nodes that are persisting, that are consistently being trusted? And EP here again is epoch. So what we want is, based on what are the nodes that are trusted, right? And the nodes that have a high epoch value. So from the epoch value here, we can detect the nodes that have a very high epoch value. So we can detect the nodes that are unstable. Here, gtrust R gives us the nodes that are stable, right, or permanently trusted. Then the set BL for blacklist is basically the set of nodes that appear neither, or that are neither unstable nor permanently trusted. Then we get the nodes that are permanently untrusted, right? So that's how we ended up constructing the set of blacklisted nodes. On the other hand, from epoch here and the blacklist, we can construct gtrust R in a very intuitive way. We get rid of all the nodes that are unstable. We get rid of all the blacklisted nodes, and we end up with the nodes that are permanently trusted. So now the interesting thing is, we know that having a perfect trust detector is not good enough. Having a trust tracker allows us to solve the offloading problem. Can we implement the trust tracker, right? Can we implement a trust tracker that allows us to solve the offloading problem? Unfortunately, the result is it is impossible to implement that trust tracker, right? Even in a system which is synchronous, even if we have a lot of guarantees from the network, we cannot implement the trust tracker. So you'll end up telling me, so how is that possible? That we know what are the properties of the device we need. How is it possible that we can't implement? Well, it is very similar. The intuition is, when we try to sample the state of the edge nodes, an edge node may go bad, right, and then come back to good again within a sampling period. So what happens is, I can try to sample a given edge node. At that point, the edge node may be good, right? And then when I'm ready to send a job, right, in between, that edge node is bad. And before the start of the next sampling period, it comes back to good again, right? So in between two sampling period, the edge node may turn bad, and that will be missed by Sigma, right, by the trust tracker. Now you can tell me, well, maybe you can make your sampling period smaller, right? We can increase the sampling rate. Yes, this can be done, but again, the same argument, right? The same argument will happen. So as we try to make the sampling period smaller and smaller, of course, what happens is the chances of, or the probability of an edge node going bad decreases. So because of that, because as sampling period becomes smaller, the probability of missing such behavior will decrease. We end up looking at the problem of what we call probabilistic offloading, right? So rather than looking at the notion of deterministic computational offloading, we look at the problem of probabilistic offloading, right? So what we want to do then is basically, sorry. Yeah, so probabilistic offloading says, given an IoT device C and a task J, right? The offloading problem of J by the task J by the IoT device is defined as follows. Can we find an edge node R such that C will offload, the IoT device C will offload the task J to the edge node R only if C trusts R with a high probability, right? And eventually, C will trust R with a high probability, which we denote by PT, right? So here, we've taken the notion of, let's say, deterministic offloading. We made it become probabilistic by adding a certain notion of probability. So what we want here is to be able to calculate what is PC and PT, right? So to calculate PC and PT, we need to understand the probability of the trust tracker to return an incorrect information to the offloading engine. If we focus on PC, so basically when an IoT device trusts an edge node with a high probability PC, right? The probability that correctness condition of offloading is satisfied. A violation will mean that the output, which we call G trust R, which we found here, the output of the offloading engine, the way it will become, this can happen is G trust R has at least one, what we call a fake node. It is a node which is unstable, but it appears as good, right? That fake node, well, for that fake node, this happens when a node turns bad shortly after being sampled, but then it turns good before it is next sampled, right? So that fake node, it is bad, but it's able to fake to appear as if it is good, right? So what we did was we just, we want to be able to have what the probability of this fake node to happen, or at least to be present in that output. So if we denote by P the probability of a node to be fake in a given round of the Truss Tracker, right? So the expected number of fake nodes in any given round is given by P times R, where R is the number of edge nodes, right? And if we assume that F follows the number of fake nodes follow a Poisson distribution, what we end up seeing is as the value of the size of G Truss R increases, right, the probability of satisfying the offloading process, right, the probability of offloading to a correct edge node tends to 1, right? So this is a quick graph to show here the probability of a given node to be fake, here the number of edge nodes in the network, and this one basically what is the probability of doing a correct offloading, right? So when the size of the permanently trusted node is 2, right, and the number of samples we end up taking is 8, what we end up saying is as the value of P, the chances of a node to be fake increases, right, we end up seeing that the probability of the correct offloading decreases. On the other hand, here, when we end up having the number of permanently trusted nodes to be quite high, so because half of the edge nodes are trusted, and we've done a lot of sampling, so sigma is equal to 18, we've done a lot of sampling, the chances of a wrong offloading, right, is very small, or the probability of a good offloading is basically greater than 90%, even when the probability of a given edge node to be bad is around 20%. Right. So how do we do that? How do we do the offloading algorithm? Well, the way we developed the offloading algorithm is a little bit based on the challenge response technique that we typically find when trying to develop techniques for denial of service. Right. So the protocol that we execute on an IoT node is as follows. The IoT node creates one challenge for the challenge response for each edge node, right? And then it sends that challenge to the respective edge node. And then, of course, when the edge node receives the challenge, right? So, and the challenge is basically similar to the one that happens in Bitcoin blockchain. We have to compute. We have to find the right value that computes to a given hash, right? So once the edge node receives the challenge, it adds it to the buffer, and then it tries to compute it, and then sends the response back to the IoT device. The IoT device will wait for that response for each edge node, right? And the response can be good, bad, or delayed, right? And based on the response, if the state of the edge node was previously bad, and now it is good, we increase the epoch value, right? So, and we remove that edge node from the blacklist. On the other hand, if it was previously good, now it is bad, or the response has been delayed, again, we increase the epoch value, right? And we add that edge node to the bad list. And we do that repeatedly. So the idea is the edge node will have to engage in a challenge response. It has to be able to, in some sense, put some of its resources into that. And very often what will happen is when we do that, nodes that are going to misbehave will prefer not to engage in that challenge response. Only nodes that are permanently good will engage with this challenge response. So we run a small experiment that involved, we had 6 share modes, right? And each one was connected to a Raspberry Pi for output logging. We had a node 1, which we denoted as a root node, that was mostly concerned with cryptographic primitives, right? Setting up keys, and so anything to do with security, that was the role of the root node. We had nodes number 2 and node number 6 to behave as the edge node, and then we had IoT nodes to be nodes 3, 4, and 5. We assume the network to be fully connected. So basically, all the IoT nodes 3, 4, and 5 could talk to any of those edge nodes 2 and 6, and they could communicate to the root node, and vice versa. All nodes could speak to each other. The Raspberry Pi at the root was the one responsible for providing network services, right? And the Raspberry Pi at the edge node was basically the one that was running the intensive applications. And IoT devices perform environment monitoring every minute. The challenge response was similar to the proof of work in blockchain, right? And each edge node have to prove to IoT devices that a certain amount of computational effort has been expended, right? And because IoT nodes have resource constraint, checking or verifying that a given answer, that a given response is good is easy, right? Reducing the chances of malicious attackers, or what we call fake nodes. So here, so again, if you node number 2 and number 6 were the edge nodes, right? And then 3, 4, and 5 were the IoT nodes. When both edge nodes were good, right, what you can see is most of the time, at some point in time, when we were running the experiments, at that time, it was between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock. At a given point in time, we could see that the epoch number increased from 1 and then increased to 2 for both resource-rich node 2, for edge node 2, and then edge node 6, right? And here, what we see is in green, it's whenever an edge node is trusted, and in gray, whenever an edge node is untrusted, right? So what we see here is for edge node number 6, right, and number 2, for example, the IoT device number 5 ended up trusting resource edge node number 6 all the time. On the other hand, there was some issue with IoT device number 3 trusting here edge node number 6 and here edge node number 2. For this one, what happened was the challenge response timed out. So it means the IoT device didn't get the response back from the edge node. And here, on the other hand, when the challenge response was submitted, right, the IoT device didn't get an acknowledgement that the challenge response was received. So though the edge nodes were good, right, these two events were basically because of the quality of the links between the edge nodes and the IoT devices, right? So these were issues due to network unreliability. On the other hand, when one of the edge nodes, so node 2 was good and node 6 was bad, right? What we saw is for edge node number 6, all the IoT devices basically ended up not trusting the edge node number 6. Everything is in gray, right? On the other hand, with edge node number 2, what we saw is IoT device number 4 at some point in time had one small problem, right? One small problem, and you can see what happens. The link was the link was bad, and the challenge response timed out, right? So that was the only one. On the other hand, because edge node number 6 was bad, all the time the value that node was untrusted, and the type of problems was multiple. Either it decided not to send an acknowledgement for the challenge response, or it decided not to respond back, or the type of response was bad. So here you end up getting, for example, green one, which is the response wasn't good, or an orange one, meaning that the response timed out. So there were loads of different issues that happened. Now, when node 2 was good and node 6 was unstable, right? So if you can see, we look at the epoch number versus the time, right? At some point in time, node 2 was good, but because of network unreliability, the links fluctuating, the value of the epoch number for node number 2 increased a little bit, but it was bounded, just like what we expected, right? So if a node is good or if a node is permanently bad, right, that the epoch number is going to be bounded. On the other hand, for a node that is unstable, the epoch number ends up increasing very quickly. So here, in red here, IoT device number 4 was evaluating edge node number 6 at this value. On the other hand, IoT device number 5 was evaluating edge node number 6 epoch value as that much, right? And again, when we look at how the behavior ends up changing, right, we can see that for edge node number 6, which is this and that and this one, it alternates. We can see the unstable behavior. It alternates between trusted, untrusted, trusted, untrusted, and so on. On the other hand, edge node number 2, apart from a few issues because of network reliability, we end up having them being trusted most of the time. So here we've looked at the individual sampling of the truss trackers of different edge nodes. So now we want to look a little bit about the number of jobs that are actually offloaded. Here, what we see is in blue, jobs that are offloaded to edge node number 2, and in orange, jobs that are offloaded to edge node number 6, right? As we can see, very often what happens is jobs being offloaded a lot more to edge node number 2, whereas whenever edge node number 6 was misbehaving, the number of nodes, the number of jobs that were offloaded to that edge node was very small, right? So here it talks a little bit about, it gives rise to the problem of having the wrong suspicion, right? Or not suspecting a node to be misbehaving. So what we did was we ended up trying to classify edge node number 6, whether the suspicion was good or bad. So we did it by green, right? When it's a true positive and blue true negative. True positive means the node is good and it is detected as being good. A true negative means a node is bad and it is being detected as bad, right? And a false positive means a node was bad, but it is detected as good, and false negative as should be. So here for edge node number 6, as we can see, very often it was detected as true negative. We could actually detect that it was misbehaving. But often what happens is we were detecting some false positive as well, right? So we tried to look at why was it the case that there were some false positive. What we found out was to reduce the chances of misbehavior, in some sense, you want to be able to do the sampling. You want to be able to test, to sample the state of the edge node more often, right? You want to increase the sampling period, you want to decrease the sampling period. But as you end up sending more and more challenges, right, at some point in time, you end up detecting that a node, just because it end up sending the right answer, right, you end up classifying the node as good, when actually it was just a good one during a bad period. So what we end up seeing is that there is a trade-off to be done, right, between the amount of sampling we need to do, right? So the trade-off between challenge rate, the timeout that we end up setting, and how we characterize the duration of stability, right? So this, in some sense, is an area of what we're still looking at. How are we going to analyze the challenge rate, the timeout, and the duration of stability to be able to properly characterize a node as being properly crashed or properly unstable or properly working? So 84% of the time, classification of edge node number 6 was correct. Either we classified it to be true positive or it was a true negative, right? And 16% of the time, we had it wrongly. So this is an area where we're looking into trying to understand a little bit better what the interaction between network link, network quality, and those parameters of the algorithms. And the interesting thing as well is that Truss Tracker can be pushed into a network stack. So we can enhance the network stack of any IoT devices right? To be able to allow us to do a proper offloading. So why did we do that? Well, there is a large body of work on trust models in agent-based systems. Trust models in agent-based system has been around for a long, long time. Some of them come up with sophisticated mathematical model. More recent ones has started looking at machine learning to be able to predict what are the nodes that can be trusted. However, when we use trust models, to make the models more kind of resilient and more up to date, we need issues, or at least we need aspects of what we call a decay function to account for the recency of interactions, or we need other concepts such as relevance to be able to keep track. Keeping track of the entire interaction history, and also of to make sure that we have aspect of recency and relevance, it means that we need to keep track of a large amount of information to do that. Because of that, right, the amount of information that we end up having to keep is basically of the of the size, the number of edge nodes times multiplied by the size of the history of the interaction. In distributed systems, there is another technique called FDIR, which is fault detection, isolation, and reconfiguration, which makes use of the concept of what we call count and threshold, right? And again, the complexity is the number of IoT nodes times the number of edge nodes, right? And again, the amount of memory that we need is very large. On the other hand, with our approach, we only need to send data, we only need to send challenge response to a given number of edge nodes. So our approach only scale from is of the of complexity or edge. Some future work, like we said, we need to have energy-aware adaptive sampling, right? And we want to be able to integrate omission failures and deal with network unreliability. So this work was supported by funding from PETROS, the National Center of Excellence for IoT System Cybersecurity, right? And it's been done in conjunction with Professor Tim Watson and Dr. Matthew Bradbury. Any question? And I apologize for having gone over time.
Not at all, Arshad, thank you. Karanjot, you have asked a question here. Do you want to just unmute and ask it? Or has that already been answered in subsequent slides?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
It's a great information, by the way. Sir, I wanted to ask, like in the algorithm that you presented, so we are essentially adding the epoch value to make a node, to reduce its confidence, right? That it's stable, it's no longer stable. So can we somehow convert the unstable nodes to stable nodes as the time passes by? Like maybe there is some distribution of resources among the other nodes, so the current node has become stable. So is that possible, or only the vice versa is true?
Right. So thank you very much. So the way we're doing it here is to characterize a node as being stable or unstable, we use a threshold value. So for example, depending on the application that you have running, right? So if your application, for example, is safety critical, maybe you will set the threshold for your epoch value to be, let's say, 3 or 4, to say that, well, as soon as the node starts flipping, we will classify it as unstable. On the other hand, it could be that if you have an application which is non-critical, let's say environment monitoring, where you can say, well, it doesn't really matter how many times it flips. It can have a value of 40, right? We will still classify that node as that edge node as stable, right? So depending on how you you end up setting the threshold for your epoch value to discriminate between a stable or unstable node, right? That will allow you to decide how you integrate an edge node as being stable or not, right? Of course, we can try to use genetic algorithm to try to, for example, see what will be an optimal value for a given application, what will be an optimal value for that threshold, so that you increase the availability of the network. but that's again another project, another work for some other time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, sir.
So Arshad, being the troublemaker and the least intelligent student, always I want to just validate my understanding of what you've been talking about here. So I mean, if you go back to your experiment, you talked about having 6 which were essentially Raspberry Pis, right? So they had the same kind of configuration, similar compute power, battery power, and everything. But you have simulated different functions within the wireless sensor network, I guess, across those 6. Is that right?
We had some we had sensor nodes, right? We had actually sensor nodes. They were connected to Raspberry Pis just for logging, so that we can right. So the sensor nodes were doing, so they had sensors such as temperature monitoring, right, and humidity. Right. So these were the applications that we were looking at.
Right. Right. So there weren't 6 Raspberry Pis. You were basically saying there were some sensor nodes that were, just sensing something, right? So say we were talking about an agriculture project where we had sensors that were getting the temperature, some were getting moisture information, and so on, right? Yes. And now the assumption is that we need some compute nodes in that wireless network because we want to actuate some actions potentially also.
You can potentially
right? I'm just giving a scenario here. So what we are saying is that the sensor nodes themselves don't have the compute power to make any decisions necessarily, or may not have enough battery power, or whatever it might be. So they are offloading some of their data to the compute node, and the compute node is doing the computation and sending back something that can actuate through another node, say an action, right? So we might decide, hey, the soil moisture levels are low, we need to switch on the sprinkler, for example, right? And the whole idea here of trusted nodes is the fact that you don't want to spend too much of the limited battery you have to continue to ping the nodes all the time. You're actually wanting to somehow believe that when you send your data as a sensor to the compute node, you're going to get an answer out of it, and it's not going to miss out. Is that what it is?
So this one is, let's say if we take the question, the problem of actuating, what you don't want is, for example, you send all your data to a node, let's say that has, let's say, some malware on it, and then even though the decision is to actuate, it decides, I'm not going to do anything, I'll just leave it as it is.
Right. Okay.
It does the wrong thing in some sense.
So the sprinkler decides in its own way that I'm not going to bother listening to you and switch on the water, right? And I need the water.
Right. So by the time, let's say you sample the temperature, the humidity of the soil, let's say the output should be, you don't need to do anything, but the edge node decides, well, I'm going to just open the sprinkler and just flood the whole thing.
Right. Okay. And so what we are assuming here from a trusted perspective is really that whatever action we are expecting is taken, and that computation that may be done is passed on to an edge node also, that again is believed to be capable of taking the action or taking the action we wanted to take, rather than having a mind of its own, right? That's
so
kind of what.
Again, this is almost like, application dependent. We've tried to stay away from the application.
Just a very simple example I was giving to try and kind of bring it into a kind of a application.
Yeah. So what we wanted to do is, for example, when about Nathan, he does work in Trust.
Yes.
So what we wanted to do is, when you look at the work on agent-based systems, to be able to evaluate trust, you need a long interaction. You have to keep track of every single interaction, which for IoT nodes you just won't have.
Yeah.
Very often, what you see is in those agent systems, the notion of trust is very reactive. You do something, you learn from it, and then you do something in the future. Our premise was, well, I don't need to know about other people. If I want, let's say, a plumber now, I'll just try to sample the state of the plumber during that time. And if I'm satisfied during that sampling period, I trust him. It doesn't matter whether he was trusted or not 2 months ago. I just want to sample him during that time. And if I'm happy with it, I'll hire him. Right.
Okay.
So here, then the idea is rather than making trust reactive, we make it more proactive.
Right.
So then the amount of interaction we need shrinks a lot, and we can actually fit it in memory.
Right. So in that experimental setup, there was also a root node. What is that? The role of that root node? You talked about it having the.
So the root node basically is responsible for digital signatures and giving you access to keys, more of the kind of security, just to be able to validate. Well, we're getting the answer from someone, so you look at the message. Yes, it's properly signed, and okay. So that's the whole point.
Very interesting.
More like identity management in some sense.
Right. Okay. Well, Arshad, thank you so much. I mean, I think this has been a wonderful session. I was lucky that whatever I was going to disappear for got disappeared for me. So I was able to attend 95% of your talk. And really, I mean, sorry?
You offloaded the job onto someone else.
Offloaded the job, yes. So we end up, with what I understand. I mean, you've touched upon a number of different aspects of what we are trying to build here, right? In terms of, obviously, there's the IoT angle to it. There's a security angle to it, which I think, is a big unexplored and probably a big challenge area within wireless networks and IoT devices in general. Yes. And then this whole area of trust, right, which I think is very important in any kind of distributed computing environment. You also touched upon, and of course, you mentioned Nathan, and I hope that we can convince him to come and give a talk also sometime on multi-agent systems, because it really brings a different perspective to all of us.
Yeah. So no,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having invited me. At some point, we can talk about different possibilities for collaboration.
Yes, no, absolutely. We are very excited about that, and thank you for taking the time out. And I do hope that we can collaborate, at least on some of the Sabudh projects, if not really even in BML Munjal University, where obviously we'd be very keen for you to come and, even do a course with our students sometimes, on any of these subjects, really, whether it's wireless sensor networks or, trust or reliability. Because I remember that, when we collaborated on creating reliable software and using machine learning for that, that was a fun time. So I really appreciate that. Yes, no, it was
one of the things that we're interested in doing right now when we look at trust is also to make sure that the data that we gather is trusted, right? So there is no point in learning from untrusted data, right? So I've got students working on a project, what we call digital forensics, but basically we're trying to make sure that the data that we are learning, that the data we're collecting is trusted, right? So this is, so we are looking at how do we almost like cross-check different data before we actually save it in a log when you can have adversaries in the network.
Yeah. And that's actually another topic. So when I was thinking about all the things that you touched upon, I think one of the things that we've also been talking about is how, whenever intelligent algorithms come along, so do intelligent ways of attacking those algorithms come along, right? And, I've talked about Google bombs and so on as ways in which, very, very good, well-meaning algorithms that were developed were actually manipulated, right? Recommender systems, another area. So that's very interesting.
You can have those kind of data injection attacks where
that's right.
They end up sending one false message, one false data, and then all of a sudden it gives you sufficient amount of noise to cause problem in your learning algorithm. So this is something we're looking at under the kind of umbrella term of forensics. Right.
And of course, I mean, with unexplainable AI models, it makes it even worse, right? So.
Indeed, right. So this is another area I've started looking at explainable AI, but not from machine learning perspective, but more from a kind of distributed systems perspective.
Right.
What is it that we can explain given we know a certain specification? So, but again, this is another area that we can talk about for at some point.
No, absolutely. And, I guess we should spare everybody here and we'll catch up offline in any case with our
everyone. Have a
Thank
good
you.
afternoon.
Yes, and you have a good weekend. So
Yeah,
given that
thank
you're
you
just
very
starting
much.
your weekend here.
Yeah.
All right,
All right.
take care.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you.